A single knife in the dark could rewrite the ancient world. This video explores 22 pivotal assassinations, revealing how political murder forged empires and toppled dynasties. You will discover how the secret deaths of pharaohs, kings, and generals triggered chain reactions that altered the course of civilization for centuries. Was a Roman reformer's murder the first step toward civil war? How did the poisoning of a general's father create one of history's most famous avengers? By the end, you will understand history not as a series of inevitable events, but as a fragile story shaped by conspiracy and bloodshed. How much of our world was built on a foundation of forgotten murders? The illusion of divine power shattered in the shadow of the pyramids. Our first story begins in the heat-baked corridors of an Egyptian palace, where the very first assassination we will examine tore apart the established order. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was considered a living god on earth, an unassailable figure whose rule was woven into the fabric of the cosmos. His invincibility was the bedrock of society. Then, one day, he was gone, not from old age or illness, but from a blade wielded by a hand he trusted. This was not just a murder, it was a cosmic crime. The killer, likely a usurper from within the royal court, did more than end a life. He murdered an idea. He proved that the god-king was mortal, that the throne was not a divine right but a prize that could be taken by the most ruthless and ambitious. The carefully maintained illusion of stability crumbled instantly. If a pharaoh could be killed, then no ruler was ever truly safe again. This single act of regicide planted a seed of profound political instability that would haunt Egyptian dynasties for centuries. It established the most dangerous of precedents, that ultimate power could be seized through conspiracy and bloodshed. A lesson was learned in those sun-bleached halls, a dark secret that would echo from the banks of the Nile to the heart of Rome. The long, bloody history of political murder had found its first, terrifying blueprint. That dangerous precedent did not remain confined to Egypt. A few centuries later, and a world away, the same violent logic erupted in the very heart of the Roman Republic. The victim was a man named Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the people who dared to challenge the established order. His crime was not treason, but reform. He proposed redistributing public land to the common citizens, a direct threat to the wealth and power of the senatorial elite. For this, he was declared a public enemy. A mob of senators and their supporters, armed with wooden clubs and the splintered legs of benches, hunted him down on the Capitoline Hill. They beat him to death and threw his body into the Tiber River. This was not a covert poisoning in a shadowy palace. This was a public, brutal lynching carried out by the state's most respected leaders in a space that was supposed to be sacred. The unthinkable had happened. A political disagreement, a debate over land rights, had been settled not with votes or rhetoric, but with clubs. The long-standing taboo against political murder within the city's sacred boundary, the pomerium, was shattered forever. The death of Tiberius Gracchus tore the Republic in two. It created an unbridgeable chasm between the aristocratic optimates, who held to the old ways, and the populist populares, who championed the people's cause. From that day forward, the stakes of Roman politics were no longer just power or prestige, but life itself. The precedent was set. If you could not out-argue your opponent, you could simply eliminate him. This single act of public violence introduced a poison into the body politic, a cycle of retaliation and escalating bloodshed that would, over the next century, consume the Republic in a series of devastating civil wars. The tools of political debate had been permanently replaced by the weapons of civil war. The poison of political murder soon seeped from the Roman Forum to the heart of a vast Eastern empire. In the dusty highlands of ancient Persia, a royal secret festered. The king, Cambyses II, was away on a military campaign in Egypt when news of a rebellion reached him. His own brother, a prince named Barca, had seized the throne, but by the time Cambyses raced home to confront the usurper, he died under mysterious circumstances, leaving his brother as the sole ruler. For 7 months, Barca reigned. Then, a nobleman named Darius and 6 co-conspirators stormed the palace and killed him. The official story, carved forever into a cliff face at Behistun, claims Darius did not murder a true prince. He slew an impostor, a cunning magus who had pretended to be the royal brother. This was the tale Darius needed the world to believe. It transformed a brutal regicide into a heroic act of salvation, a necessary purge to restore the rightful bloodline. But the truth is lost to time. Was he truly a usurping magus, or was he the legitimate prince, eliminated by a powerful noble who saw his own chance for a crown? This assassination, justified by what might be history's most monumental piece of propaganda, cemented the power of Darius the Great. His reign stabilized the empire and expanded its borders, creating the colossal power that would later send armies to clash with the Greeks at Marathon and Thermopylae. Yet the murder of Barca, whether prince or pretender, established a dark new precedent for the Persian throne. It taught future kings that the greatest threat often came not from foreign enemies, but from within their own family and court. The path to power was now paved with the blood of rivals, a lesson that would echo through the halls of Persian palaces for generations. The brutal logic of regicide found its perfect stage in a wedding celebration. King Philip II of Macedon had spent decades transforming his kingdom from a peripheral backwater into the dominant military power of Greece. His army was a perfected weapon, his political alliances were secured, and his grand ambition, the invasion of the colossal Persian Empire, was finally within reach. All of this climaxed at the grand public wedding of his daughter. In the midst of the festivities, as Philip walked unguarded into the theater, a former bodyguard named Pausanias stepped forward and stabbed him to death. The official story was one of personal vengeance, a grievance over a private insult, but the murder of a king at the very peak of his power and in full view of his entire court reeks of a deeper conspiracy. Who truly stood to gain? Suspicion fell immediately upon his exiled wife, the fiercely ambitious Olympias, and even upon his own son, Alexander. The young prince was known to have a volatile relationship with his father, and Philip's death cleared his path to the throne in the most direct way possible. With one thrust of a dagger, the greatest invasion plan of the age was thrown into chaos. The entire Macedonian project, built so carefully by Philip, now teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet from this sudden, bloody vacuum of power, a new and even greater legend would emerge. The 20-year-old Alexander seized control, ruthlessly eliminating any rivals, and took up his father's banner. The invasion of Persia was launched not by the seasoned king, but by his untested son. What followed was one of the most breathtaking campaigns in military history, a conquest that stretched from Egypt to the borders of India. Alexander's legacy Hellenized the known world, spreading Greek culture, language, and ideas across 3 continents, but all of it hinged on that single, shocking murder in the theater. It forces us to ask a profound question. How much of our recorded history is the product of a lone assassin's blade, a momentary act of violence that sent the future careening down an entirely different, unimaginable path? The same violent impulse that toppled kings also stalked the birthplace of democracy. In the bustling agora of ancient Athens, a different kind of power struggle was unfolding, one not for a crown, but for the voice of the common man. At the center of this struggle was a statesman named Ephialtes. He was the quiet architect behind Athenian democracy's most radical expansion, a man who believed true power should reside not with a wealthy few, but with the popular assembly of all citizens. His great reform was a direct assault on the city's oldest and most conservative institution, the Areopagus Council. This body, composed of former archons who held their positions for life, served as the ultimate guardian of tradition and the interests of the aristocratic elite. Ephialtes systematically stripped the Areopagus of its political power, transferring that authority to the Council of 500 and the popular courts, institutions where ordinary Athenian men could directly shape the laws and judge their betters. This was more than a policy shift, it was a revolution, and it created enemies with everything to lose. One evening, as Ephialtes walked home, he was struck down by an assassin's blade. His killer was never officially identified, but the shadow of his political opponents, the aristocrats whose influence he had broken, fell heavily over the crime. This was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated, reactionary strike designed to decapitate the democratic movement in a single, bloody moment. The murder of Ephialtes sent a chilling message to every reformer who would follow. It proved that the fight for popular governance would be met with the most extreme resistance. While his death did not reverse his reforms, his work was famously carried forward by his protege, the great Pericles. Yet this assassination stands as a stark, often forgotten monument to a simple truth. Democracy was not born in peaceful debate. It was forged in conflict, and its cradle was stained with the blood of its first champions. The shadow of a father's ambition fell long across the ancient world. As Rome tightened its grip on the Western Mediterranean, its greatest rival, Carthage, was guided by the strategic genius of one man, Hamilcar Barca. He was the mastermind who had kept the city's hopes alive after its defeat in the First Punic War, a commander of such skill and vision that he was actively expanding a new empire for Carthage in the resource-rich lands of Hispania. Then, during a campaign, he was gone. The official accounts speak of drowning in a river, but the persistent whispers of history tell a different tale, one of poison. Whether the hand that administered it belonged to a Roman agent, a jealous political rival in the Carthaginian Senate, or a local chieftain, the result was the same. A brilliant mind was erased from the strategic board at the most critical of moments. This quiet, murky assassination did more than just end a life. It removed the one leader who might have consolidated Carthaginian power and perhaps even avoided the catastrophic conflict to come. His death created a sudden, dangerous vacuum of power. Into that void stepped his young son, a boy who had sworn a lifelong oath of hatred against Rome. That boy was Hannibal. Thrust into command prematurely by his father's mysterious demise, Hannibal did not merely continue his father's work. He weaponized his grief, transforming it into one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. His legendary march across the Alps with war elephants was not just a tactical maneuver. It was the opening move in a personal war of vengeance, a war ignited by the poisoning of Hamilcar Barca. The conspirators who removed one formidable leader could never have foreseen the terrifying consequence. They did not create a power vacuum, they forged an avenger. Even in Sparta, a society built on iron discipline and rigid order, the thirst for power could not be contained. The aged King Cleomenes I was a force of nature, a ruler whose aggressive and often erratic maneuvers on the Peloponnesian chessboard had unnerved allies and enemies alike. He meddled in the affairs of Athens, clashed with the powerful city of Argos, and seemed to operate with a frightening autonomy that threatened the delicate balance of Sparta's unique dual kingship. Then, suddenly, he was gone. The official story was one of madness and tragic suicide. After a series of bizarre actions, his co-king, Leotychides from the rival Eurypontid line, had him imprisoned. There, in custody, Cleomenes was said to have taken his own life, but few in the ancient world believed this convenient tale. The whispers spoke of murder, a quiet, sanctioned killing within the very heart of the Spartan state. His death was too timely, too beneficial for his political rivals. It removed the most unpredictable and powerful voice in Spartan foreign policy, clearing the path for the Eurypontid line to consolidate its influence and steer the city toward a different, more confrontational course against Athens. This was not a public lynching or a dagger in a theater. It was a cold, clinical elimination, a political correction disguised as a personal tragedy. The murder of Cleomenes I proved that no institution, not even the revered dual monarchy, was safe from the scheming of its own leaders. It was a chilling demonstration that when a ruler became too inconvenient, the Spartan system could and would consume its own. This single act of regicide shifted the entire political landscape of Greece, tilting Sparta toward the hardened stance that would soon erupt into the decades-long devastation of the Peloponnesian War. A king's mysterious death in a Spartan prison did not just end a life. It set the stage for a conflict that would bleed the entire Greek world dry. The cycle of political murder did not spare the vibrant city-states of ancient Greece. In the bustling port of Corinth, a dynasty built on power and fear met its end not with a single knife but with a popular roar. The story begins with the tyrant Cypselid, a ruler who seized control and remarkably died of old age in his bed. But his legacy of power was carried by his son Periander, who ruled with an even heavier hand. Under their dynasty, Corinth flourished, its wealth and influence soaring. Trade routes expanded, magnificent temples were built, and the city became a hub of art and commerce. Yet this prosperity came at a terrible cost. The Cypselids maintained their grip through brutal repression, silencing dissent and ruling without the consent of the people they governed. For decades, the citizens endured this trade-off, wealth in exchange for freedom. But the patience of a populace has its limits. The death of the elder tyrant did not break the system, but the continued harshness of his son finally did. A popular uprising erupted, and Periander was overthrown and killed, his body likely cast out as a symbol of the people's reclaimed power. This was not a covert assassination by a rival faction. It was a public execution, a collective act of vengeance that shattered the tyranny and re-established an oligarchic government. The fall of the Cypselid dynasty sent a seismic shock through the Greek world. It forced every other tyrant to look at their own cities and their own subjects with a new, fearful eye. The message was terrifyingly clear. You could build a city of gold, but if you ruled through fear alone, the very people you controlled could one day rise up and tear it all down. The prosperity you provided would be no shield against their thirst for liberty. This event proved that assassination is a weapon that can cut in any direction. It can place a ruler on the throne, and it can just as easily drag them from it, leaving only a cautionary tale written in blood for the next would-be autocrat to ponder. The noble dream of a philosopher king curdled into a nightmare in the sun-drenched city of Syracuse. Dion was no ordinary ruler. A student of the great Plato himself, he was the living embodiment of a grand intellectual experiment. He had used his influence to overthrow the brutal tyrant Dionysius II, a man he was related to by marriage. The people of Syracuse hailed him as a liberator, a man who would finally build the just city described in his teacher's philosophical dialogues, a state governed by wisdom instead of brute force. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Plato's ideal had taken root in the real world. But absolute power proved to be a corrosive acid. The very qualities that made Dion a brilliant philosopher, his unwavering commitment to his ideals, made him a rigid and uncompromising leader. The messy, demanding reality of daily governance, the need for pragmatic deals and popular concessions, chafed against his pure vision. The liberator began to look unsettlingly like the tyrant he had replaced, ruling not with the consent of the people, but with the certainty of his own righteousness. The man who had been trusted to wield power for the good of all became, in the eyes of many, a new autocrat. The final, tragic blow came from within his own circle of trust. His assassin was Callippus, an Athenian and a fellow disciple of Plato. This was not an attack by a political enemy or a rival faction. It was a betrayal from a brother in philosophy, a man who had shared his dreams and studied the same sacred texts. Callippus struck him down, driven by his own ambition and perhaps a twisted sense of disillusionment. The murder of Dion did more than end a life. It shattered the entire political project of Syracuse. The city, which had briefly glimpsed a future built on reason, was plunged back into the chaos of civil war and successive tyrannies. All of Dion's work, his years of struggle and his lofty ideals, unraveled in an instant. His story forces a painful question upon us. Is the perfect state an impossible dream, doomed to be corrupted by the very power required to build it? Can any leader, no matter how wise, navigate the treacherous gap between philosophical purity and the flawed, complicated humans they are trying to rule? The Nile's long, independent story was about to reach its final chapter. For nearly 4,000 years, the land of the pharaohs had maintained its unique identity, a civilization apart from the world. That era of native rule ended not with a dramatic battle, but with the quiet, desperate flight of a man named Nectanebo II. He was the last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, the final ruler of the 30th dynasty. His reign was a brief Indian summer of Egyptian power, a final attempt to hold back the encroaching shadow of the vast Persian Empire. The Persians, having once controlled Egypt, were determined to reclaim it. They marshaled a massive invasion force, and Nectanebo, a capable commander in his own right, prepared to meet them. The decisive moment came not on the battlefield, but in the realm of strategy and betrayal. The Persian army outmaneuvered his defenses, and key Egyptian allies began to abandon his cause, seeing the shifting winds of power. Realizing his position was hopeless, Nectanebo did not choose a glorious last stand. He gathered his personal treasure and fled south, disappearing into the deserts of Nubia. He was never seen again. This was an assassination in every way but the literal one. The Persian conquest did not just defeat his army, it erased his political existence. His authority, his divine kingship, his very role as pharaoh was extinguished. The independent Egypt of the pharaohs, a concept that had defined the ancient world, ceased to be in that moment. The Persians reabsorbed the kingdom, and Egypt became just another satrapy, another province in a foreign empire. This was more than a military conquest. It was the death of a 3,000-year-old tradition. The cultural and political landscape of the entire Nile Valley was irrevocably altered. Egypt was now firmly and painfully integrated into the power struggles of the Eastern Mediterranean. But this very act of imperial absorption created the conditions for the next great upheaval. The Persian grip on Egypt was resented, and that simmering resentment would soon call out for a liberator. It was this power vacuum, created by Nectanebo's political death, that would entice a young Macedonian king named Alexander to cross into Egypt and be hailed not as a conqueror, but as a savior and a new pharaoh, paving the way for the centuries-long rule of the Ptolemies. One ruler's quiet disappearance closed the book on an entire world, only to open another on a stage he would never see. A single spear thrust on a dusty Greek battlefield could unravel an empire in the making. The year was 362 BC, and the city-state of Thebes stood at the very peak of its power, a dominance forged almost entirely by the mind of one man, the general Epaminondas. He was the architect of Theban hegemony, a military genius who had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility years earlier at the Battle of Leuctra. There he had introduced a revolutionary new tactic, massing his best troops on the left wing to an unprecedented depth and crushing the elite Spartan right. It was a victory that rewrote the rules of Greek warfare and made Thebes the new leader of Greece. Now, at Mantinea, he was fighting to secure that hard-won position against a coalition of old rivals. His tactical brilliance was on full display once more. His forces were on the cusp of another decisive victory, the enemy line beginning to crumble under the weight of his famous deep formation. But in the chaos of the closing moments of the fight, as he pushed forward to press his advantage, a lone Spartan soldier drove a spear into his chest. Epaminondas fell, mortally wounded. The Theban army, moments from triumph, was suddenly leaderless. They still won the field, but the victory was hollow. The real prize, the lasting Theban empire, died with their general. He was the only man with the vision and the authority to manage the complex web of alliances and rivalries that held his creation together. Without him, the entire structure imploded. Thebes swiftly collapsed from a hegemonic power back into mediocrity, its ambitions extinguished forever. The lesson of Mantinea was brutally simple. A decade of revolutionary strategy and nation-building could be undone in one violent instant. The fate of an entire city-state, its people, its culture, and its future had hinged not on its army or its wealth, but on the single, fragile life of the man who led it. A single act of rebellion can echo across continents. As the Persian Empire consolidated its power, its control stretched west to the Greek cities dotting the coast of Asia Minor. These proud city-states, including Miletus and Ephesus, chafed under the rule of their Persian-appointed governor, a satrap named Artaphons. He was the embodiment of imperial authority, the man who collected tribute and enforced the will of the distant great king, Darius I. For years, resentment simmered. Then it exploded. In a desperate, defining act of the Ionian Revolt, rebels did not just challenge Artaphons, they assassinated him. This was no mere political protest. Murdering a satrap, the direct representative of the king, was an unforgivable crime in the eyes of the empire. It was a declaration of total war, a severing of all diplomatic ties. There could be no negotiation, no compromise after such an insult. The rebels had burned their own ships, ensuring that either they would win their freedom completely or they would be utterly destroyed. The response from the Persian throne was swift and terrible. Darius the Great, the same ruler who had solidified the empire after his own controversial rise, could not let this challenge to his authority stand. The death of his satrap demanded a lesson in imperial power, one that would resonate throughout the known world. He launched the first full-scale Persian invasion of mainland Greece. This was not a minor punitive expedition. It was the opening move in a conflict of civilizations, a direct chain of events that led to the immortal battlefields of Marathon, where the Athenian hoplites made their legendary stand, and to the narrow pass at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies wrote a story of sacrifice for the ages. The assassination of a single governor, a man whose name is often overshadowed by the wars that followed, was the spark that lit this colossal fire. It forced the scattered, often squabbling Greek city-states to confront an existential threat, forging a shared identity in the crucible of war. Without that one murder in a distant provincial capital, the cultural and political landscape of Europe might look profoundly different today. The courage of the Greeks at Salamis and Plataea was born from a desperate act of violence they themselves had initiated, a reminder that history's grandest conflicts often begin with a single, irrevocable decision. The ambition of a single family could extinguish an entire royal bloodline. After Alexander the Great's sudden death, his vast empire fractured into a chaotic scramble for power, a dangerous game where the ultimate prize was not just a province, but a claim to his legacy. At the center of this struggle was Cassander, the ruthless son of Alexander's regent, Antipater. Cassander was not a battlefield hero like the other generals, the Diadochi. His power came from cunning and a chilling willingness to do what others would not. He understood that as long as Alexander's direct heirs lived, his own ambitions would always be illegitimate. Alexander's half-brother, a simple-minded man named Philip III Ahidius, was a puppet king, but he was still a living Argide. More dangerous was Alexander's infant son, Alexander IV, born to his Bactrian wife, Roxana. Cassander moved with brutal efficiency. First, he arranged the murder of Alexander's mother, Olympias, the formidable woman who had been the dynasty's fierce protector. Then he turned to the last two remaining symbols of the old order. Both the puppet king Philip and the young heir Alexander were secretly executed, their deaths hidden from public view for a time to maintain a fragile illusion of continuity. This was not a single dramatic assassination. It was a systematic purge, a cold-blooded eradication of an entire royal house. With the Argide dynasty wiped from the earth, Cassander finally secured his prize, the throne of Macedon itself. But his victory came at a terrible cost for the world Alexander had built. Any dream of a unified empire stretching from Greece to India died with that young boy and his uncle. There would be no second Alexander, no single heir to hold the conquests together. Instead, the generals carved the territory into separate kingdoms, founding the Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and Antigonid dynasties that would define the Hellenistic age. Cassander's dynastic murder did not just change the ruler of Macedon, it permanently rewrote the map of the ancient world, shattering a unified vision into a mosaic of warring successor states. Even the most formidable empires could be crippled by a blade from within. The Seleucid Empire, a vast realm carved from Alexander's eastern conquests, was slowly fraying at its edges. Its king, Seleucus III, was a young man struggling to hold this inheritance together. His military campaign in Asia Minor was faltering, a series of setbacks that eroded the confidence of his battle-hardened officers. They saw not a leader to rally behind, but a weakness that threatened their very survival. Then, on that campaign, the unthinkable happened. The king was assassinated, and the daggers were wielded by his own men, a stark lesson in what happens when an army loses faith in its commander. This was not the act of a foreign spy or a rival dynasty. It was a violent internal correction, a coup from the ranks meant to replace incompetence with strength. And in doing so, the conspirators unleashed a force they could not possibly have foreseen. The throne passed to the dead king's younger brother, a teenager named Antiochus. History would remember him as Antiochus III the Great. He took the crown of a shrinking, demoralized kingdom and saw not its limits but its potential. With relentless energy and military genius, he launched a series of spectacular campaigns, reconquering lost territories from Anatolia to the borders of India. He nearly restored the Seleucid Empire to its former glory, earning his illustrious title. But this magnificent revival had a final, inevitable consequence. His expanding empire soon collided with another ascending power, the Roman Republic, moving eastward with its own unstoppable ambition. The murder of a weak king by his own officers did more than just change a ruler. It set in motion a chain of events that led directly to the colossal clash at the Battle of Magnesia, where the legions of Rome shattered the Hellenistic phalanx forever. One act of regicide, born from military frustration, inadvertently arranged the final, world-altering confrontation between the Greek East and the Roman West. The fate of Italy was decided not on a grand battlefield, but in the overthrow of a single king. The Etruscan lord Lars Porsena of Clusium was more than just a monarch. He was the embodiment of an older, more sophisticated world looking down upon the rough little city on the Tiber. For years, Etruscan kings had ruled Rome itself, their culture infusing the early city with its rituals, its architecture, and its very identity. But the Romans had expelled their last king and declared themselves a republic, a bold act of defiance that the Etruscan powers could not let stand. Lars Porsena marched on Rome to restore monarchical rule, to pull the fledgling republic back into the Etruscan sphere. The legends tell us he was stopped by incredible acts of heroism, like Horatius holding the bridge. But other, darker traditions whisper that he was not merely defeated, but overthrown and killed, his own people turning against him. Whether by an assassin's plot or a death in a final, forgotten battle, his end was a profound turning point. His death was the death of a dream, the final, failed attempt to reassert Etruscan dominance over the Latin plain. With Porsena gone, the threat of a foreign king imposing his will vanished. The Roman Republic was finally, irrevocably free. This liberation unlocked a ferocious new energy, no longer looking over their shoulder at a powerful Etruscan overlord. The Romans could now focus entirely on their own expansion. They began the slow, relentless process of conquering their neighbors, a project that would eventually consume the entire Italian peninsula. The culturally advanced Etruscans, with their refined art and complex religion, gradually receded from the political stage, their influence supplanted by the raw, aggressive ambition of Rome. The fall of one man, a king whose very name is half lost to legend, cleared the way for a republic that would one day command an empire. It was a crucial transfer of power, a moment where the future of Western civilization pivoted away from the older cultures of Italy and toward the brutal, world-altering destiny of Rome. History does not always require a physical blade to eliminate a threat. Sometimes, the most effective assassination happens on the page, long after the body has turned to dust. Consider the story of Brennus, the Celtic chieftain whose warriors famously sacked Rome in the 4th century BC. The actual circumstances of his death are a mystery, lost somewhere in the fog of legend. But his legacy, his very memory, was systematically murdered by Roman historians who could not allow such a humiliating defeat to stand without a powerful moral. They transformed Brennus from a formidable military leader into a caricature of barbaric savagery. In their accounts, he was not a brilliant strategist who outmaneuvered the Roman legions. He was a brute, a plunderer, a symbol of chaos who disrespectfully threw his sword onto the scales when weighing the Roman gold for tribute, snarling the famous phrase, "Vi victis." Woe to the conquered! This was a brilliant piece of political propaganda. By painting their past enemies as monstrous and uncivilized, the Romans crafted a powerful national myth of resilience. They were not a people who had been soundly defeated. They were a civilized nation, constantly under siege by savage outsiders, whose ultimate victory was a triumph of order over chaos. This character assassination served a vital purpose. It justified their own relentless imperial expansion. Every new territory they conquered, every new people they subjugated, could be framed not as aggression, but as a necessary defense of civilization itself. They were simply ensuring that no new Brennus would ever threaten the world they were building. The Romans proved that killing a reputation can be as politically potent as killing a person. They understood that whoever controls the past controls the present, and by assassinating the character of their enemies, they secured their own historical narrative for generations to come. A poisoned cup may have been the true founder of the Kingdom of Pontus. Its first ruler, Mithridates I, carved out his territory on the Black Sea coast just as the vast empire of Alexander the Great was fracturing. His ascent was a masterclass in ruthless realpolitik, a careful dance of strategic marriages, and the quiet, systematic removal of anyone who stood in his path. His own death, lost to the historical record, was likely as shadowy as the methods he used to secure his throne. This was not a dynasty born of noble heritage, but one forged in the dark arts of political survival. The lesson Mithridates I taught his descendants was simple and brutal. Power is not given, it is taken, and it must be held with an iron will. This foundational principle, written in blood from the very beginning, became the kingdom's political DNA. It echoed down through the generations, culminating in his most famous descendant, Mithridates VI. Known to history as Eupator Dionysius, this grandson of the founder would absorb that lesson with terrifying brilliance. He would become a living embodiment of his forefathers' ambition, a man who saw the encroaching Roman Republic not as an unstoppable force, but as just another rival to be eliminated. The same ruthless calculus that built the kingdom now dictated its foreign policy. Compromise was a form of weakness, and diplomacy was merely a prelude to war. The foundational violence of the first Mithridates locked his kingdom onto a trajectory of direct confrontation. It was a path that would lead his grandson to fight three of the most bitter and costly wars in Roman history, conflicts that stretched the Republic's legions to their limit and bled its treasury dry. The obscure murder of a king in a distant land had set a ticking clock, one that would not stop until the armies of Rome finally extinguished his bloodline for good. How many of history's greatest conflicts were simply the final, violent echoes of a founding crime, reverberating across the centuries? The dream of restoring Spartan glory died in a prison cell. King Augeas IV inherited a city that was a hollow echo of its legendary past. The ancient laws of Lycurgus, the rigid code of discipline and equality that had forged the finest warriors in Greece, had been abandoned. A handful of wealthy families now controlled all the land and wealth, while the citizen body, the backbone of the Spartan army, had dwindled to a pitiful few. Augeas was a young king with an old dream. He proposed a radical return to the old ways, a complete cancellation of all debts, and a massive redistribution of land to the poor. For the common people, he was a savior. For the wealthy elite who held power, he was a revolutionary who had to be stopped. They did not challenge him on the battlefield of public opinion. Instead, the ephors, the powerful magistrates who represented the interests of the rich, orchestrated his downfall. They accused him of seeking tyranny and staged a sham trial. Augeas was condemned not by a foreign enemy, but by his own government in a cold, judicial murder disguised as law and order. His execution was more than the death of a man. It was the murder of a last, best hope. It proved that the Spartan system had become so rigid, so corrupted by internal inequality, that it could no longer save itself. The very people tasked with preserving the state chose to strangle its potential revival rather than surrender their personal privileges. With Augeas gone, any chance for a Spartan renaissance evaporated. The city continued its slow, irreversible decline, becoming a political irrelevance, a museum piece that would eventually be peacefully absorbed into the growing Roman sphere. The true tragedy of his death lies in the question it forces us to ask: can a society, when faced with its own decay, ever choose survival over the selfish interests of its most powerful members? The fate of Auguste IV suggests a grim and final answer. The ruthless calculus of power in ancient Egypt demanded the sacrifice of a daughter. Berenice IV had ruled for 3 years while her father, Ptolemy XII, was in exile, begging the Roman Senate for military support to reclaim his throne. Her reign in Alexandria was stable and well regarded by the people, a brief period of competent governance without the overshadowing presence of her unpopular father. But Ptolemy's desperation in Rome came with a terrible price. He secured the backing of a Roman financier and a promise of legions, but to finalize the deal, he had to prove his unwavering commitment to Rome's interests. The message was clear: there could be no rival for the Egyptian throne, not even his own child. The moment his Roman-sponsored army restored him to the palace, his first act was to order the beheading of his daughter, Queen Berenice. This was not just a political execution. It was filicide, a father murdering his child to secure his own power. The act sent a shockwave through the Mediterranean, a stark demonstration of how deeply the Roman Republic's influence now penetrated the ancient halls of the Ptolemies. A dynasty's internal struggle was now settled not by Egyptian nobles but by Roman gold and Roman swords. This brutal consolidation of power, however, created a profound and lasting instability. The throne was secured for Ptolemy, but the dynasty itself was morally bankrupt and teetering on collapse. Into this poisoned inheritance stepped his younger daughter, a girl who learned the ultimate lesson from her sister's fate. She understood that in a world where a father could kill his daughter for a throne, survival meant mastering the game of power with absolute ruthlessness. That girl was Cleopatra VII. Her entire worldview was shaped by the bloody precedent set by her father. She saw that reliance on Roman power was not a choice, but a necessity, and that alliances with powerful Roman men were the only viable strategy to avoid her sister's grim fate. The murder of Berenice did not just end one life. It forged the cunning and determined queen who would later enchant Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, setting Egypt on its final, catastrophic collision course with the rising Roman Empire. One act of familial betrayal set the stage for one of history's most famous tragedies. The battlefield is a brutal classroom, and the lesson taught to Rome during the Social War was one of its most painful. For decades, the Italian allies, the Socii, had fought and bled alongside Roman legions, building the very empire from which they were systematically excluded. They shared the burdens of war, but not the prize of full Roman citizenship. This injustice finally ignited a full-scale rebellion, a bitter civil war between Rome and its closest partners. At the heart of this struggle was the Roman consul Publius Licinius Crassus, a commander leading the fight to suppress the very men who had once been his comrades in arms. His death was no random casualty of war. It was a deliberate surgical strike. The Italian rebels targeted him, eliminating the highest Roman authority in the field to cripple the army's leadership and shatter its morale. They understood that killing a consul was more than a military victory. It was a profound political statement. It screamed that this was not a mere revolt, but a war for equal standing, a conflict where the old rules of patron and client were dead. The assassination succeeded in its immediate goal, delivering a stunning blow to Roman prestige. Yet in the long, bloody aftermath, as Rome eventually ground down the rebellion through sheer force, a strange and profound transformation occurred. The Romans, shaken by the ferocity of a war that nearly destroyed them from within, realized they could not simply reimpose the old, unequal system. The death of Crassus and the determined resistance it symbolized forced a monumental concession. Rome began to grant citizenship to the Italian communities, not as a reward but as a necessity for survival. This single, targeted killing accelerated one of the most significant political evolutions in ancient history. The Roman Republic was no longer just a city-state ruling over subjects. It was becoming a truly Italian confederation, a broader political body whose strength would soon become the foundation for a world empire. The murder of a consul on an Italian battlefield did not just change a military campaign. It forcibly rewrote the very definition of what it meant to be Roman. The legend of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus is a warning carved into the bedrock of Roman identity. His name itself, Superbus, means the proud, a title that speaks volumes about the man tradition remembers as a tyrant. He did not inherit the throne but seized it through violence, murdering his own predecessor. His rule was one of fear, governing without the consent of the Senate or the people, and his son's crime would become the spark that lit a revolution. That crime was the rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman known for her virtue. After revealing the assault to her husband and father, she took her own life, a final, public condemnation of the royal house's corruption. Her body, displayed in the Roman Forum, became a silent, powerful accusation. The people did not merely mourn her, they rose in revolt, led by Lucius Junius Brutus. They expelled the Tarquin family from the city forever. The legends are murky on the precise details of the king's death, often placing it in battle as he tried to reclaim his throne, but the core truth remains. His reign was assassinated, his authority was murdered. This was not just the overthrow of one man, it was the ritual killing of the very idea of kingship in Rome. The story, repeated for generations, became the Republic's founding myth. It served as a constant, visceral reminder that concentrated power in the hands of one man leads to arrogance, injustice, and ultimate destruction. For 5 centuries, the mere whisper of a man seeking kingly power was enough to turn the Roman people and the Senate against him. The ghost of Superbus and the shadow of his son's crime justified every political check and balance the Republic would ever create. This foundational regicide, whether it happened exactly as the poets told or not, established a political DNA so powerful that it would shape Western conceptions of liberty and tyranny for millennia to come. The murder of a king's legitimacy proved to be more potent than any physical blade. Even a story of love and revenge could be forged into a democratic weapon. In the heart of ancient Athens, 2 men, Harmodius and Aristogiton, became legends not for how they lived but for how they killed. Their target was Hipparchus, the younger brother of the ruling tyrant Hippias, and the motive was intensely personal. Hipparchus had made an unwanted advance on the young Harmodius, insulting his honor and that of his older lover, Aristogiton. What began as a private vendetta was quickly wrapped in the language of public liberation. The 2 lovers plotted to strike down both brothers during the Grand Panathenaic Festival, hoping to ignite a popular uprising in the chaos of the murder. But the plan went terribly wrong. They successfully killed Hipparchus, but Hippias survived, protected by his guards. The tyrant's revenge was swift and brutal. Harmodius was cut down on the spot, and Aristogiton was captured, tortured, and executed. In the immediate aftermath, their act seemed a catastrophic failure. The tyranny of Hippias, far from being toppled, became harsher and more paranoid. Yet the story of the 2 lovers refused to die. After Hippias was finally expelled from Athens, the city collectively reimagined the murder. The personal grievance was downplayed, the bungled conspiracy was polished, and Harmodius and Aristogiton were reborn as the Tyrannicides, the first martyrs for Athenian liberty. The city erected bronze statues in their honor in the main public square, a permanent monument to the idea that citizens had the right, even the duty, to resist oppression. Those statues became the most powerful symbols of the young democracy, a visual promise that no single man was above the will of the people. The actual, messy murder was thus assassinated a second time, replaced by a pristine myth of patriotic sacrifice. The real men were gone, but their sculpted forms endured, reminding every Athenian that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and sometimes the courage to strike the first blow. These 22 stories are not isolated tragedies, but individual threads in a single, blood-red tapestry of power. Stepping back from the individual blades and poisons, a stark pattern emerges, a recurring political logic that governed the ancient world. Assassination was rarely an act of random madness. It was a calculated tool, a brutal form of problem-solving that appeared with predictable regularity at moments of extreme political pressure. The triggers were almost always the same: a succession crisis where the line of inheritance was unclear and the throne became a prize for the most ruthless. Thwarted ambition when a powerful noble found his path to influence blocked by a single, inconvenient person. Ideological conflict, pitting reformers against traditionalists in a struggle where debate gave way to murder. And foreign intervention where a rival kingdom found it cheaper to remove a leader than to defeat his army. Each of these murders illuminates the profound fragility of power. The pharaoh, the king, the tyrant, no matter how many guards stood at their door, were ultimately vulnerable to the conspiracy of a handful of people they were supposed to trust. These acts were the pressure release valves on systems that had no peaceful way to resolve their most intense conflicts. Perhaps the most consistent theme, however, is the law of unintended consequences. The plotters, focused on their immediate goal of removing one person, were almost blind to the chain reaction they were starting. The senators who killed Tiberius Gracchus hoped to preserve their privileges, but they ignited a century of civil war that would ultimately destroy their entire class. Cassander, by wiping out Alexander's bloodline, hoped to secure his own throne, but he permanently fractured a unified empire into warring fragments. The conspirators who killed the Seleucid king to install a stronger leader could not have dreamed they were paving the way for the Roman conquest of the Greek East. Time and again, the short-term fix of assassination created a long-term catastrophe, proving that while a knife could change the world in an instant, no one could truly control the new world they had created. From the sands of Egypt to the forums of Rome, the path of history is marked by the indelible stain of political bloodshed. These 22 assassinations were not chaotic accidents or mere footnotes. They were calculated interventions, moments where a single act of violence acted as a lever, prying the world from one timeline and forcing it onto another. A pharaoh's murder shattered the illusion of divine kingship. A Roman reformer's public lynching replaced political debate with civil war. The quiet poisoning of a general in Hispania forged his son into an avenger who would march elephants over the Alps. Each story is a testament to the terrifying power of the individual to alter the destiny of millions. History is not an inevitable, impersonal force. It is a fragile tapestry, and its most dramatic patterns were often woven by the hands of conspirators in darkened rooms. The echoes of these ancient blades are not silent. They resonate in the political uncertainties of our own time, reminding us that the structures of power are always more vulnerable than they appear. The next time you look at a map of the ancient world, remember that its borders were not just drawn by treaties and battles, but by secrets and daggers. If this journey through history's darkest turning points has captivated you, subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our world. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these ancient assassinations do you believe sent the most powerful shockwave through time?